The scorching Phoenix sun had barely risen over the desert mountains when Victoria Chen pulled her rental Honda into the parking lot of Chen Global Retail Store 47. At 42, she'd built her empire from a single discount store into a nationwide chain, but today she wore faded jeans and a plain t-shirt. Her usual designer suits hung untouched in her penthouse closet. She adjusted the weathered baseball cap that had belonged to her late father, the man who'd taught her that success meant nothing if your people were suffering. Victoria took a sip from her thermos of green tea, a morning ritual that centered her before difficult days. Today would be more difficult than she knew. Nobody recognized her as she pushed through the glass doors into the air-conditioned store. The morning shift was just beginning, and she could hear the familiar sounds of a retail operation coming to life. Cash registers beeping their startup sequences, the rumble of shopping carts, the quiet conversations of employees preparing for another day. But then she heard something else. Something that shouldn't exist in any workplace she owned. Muffled sobbing echoed from the employee restroom near the customer service desk. Victoria stopped walking. Through the gap under the door, she could see a silver name badge lying on the wet tile floor. David Rodriguez Custodial Staff. The crying inside wasn't just sadness. It was the sound of someone whose world was crumbling. Her blood ran cold. Just 3 months ago, corporate had received glowing reports about this location. Perfect employee satisfaction scores, 0 complaints, outstanding management reviews. But the man crying behind that door told a completely different story. As she stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights, one question burned through her mind. If this was happening in her own company, under her own nose, what else had she missed? An older woman in a red vest walked past, glancing at the restroom door with what looked like practiced indifference. She'd heard this before. Others had heard this before, and no one had done anything about it. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. She'd spent her career building a company culture based on respect and dignity. Every policy manual, every training program, every corporate value statement emphasized treating employees like family. But policies meant nothing if they weren't enforced, and family didn't abandon each other when times got tough. She knocked gently on the restroom door. "Excuse me, are you okay in there?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. She heard shuffling, then the sound of someone trying to compose themselves. "I'm fine, just give me a minute." But his voice betrayed everything. This wasn't fine. This was a man drowning in desperation. When David Rodriguez finally emerged, Victoria saw a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and calloused hands. His custodial uniform was wrinkled, and his dark hair was streaked with premature gray. He quickly bent to retrieve his name badge, but his hands shook so badly he could barely grasp it. "I'm sorry," he whispered in accented English, not making eye contact. "I shouldn't be. I need to get back to work." Victoria studied him more closely. David's hands were cracked and raw from harsh cleaning chemicals. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, the kind that came from working multiple jobs and never getting enough sleep. But it was something else that caught her attention. The way he flinched when footsteps approached from the main sales floor. "You don't look fine," Victoria said softly. "I'm Vicky, by the way. Just started here today." David glanced up, seeming to assess whether this stranger could be trusted. After a moment, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "It's just, everything's falling apart," he admitted. "My son Miguel needs surgery. His kidney condition is getting worse and I can't afford." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." "How long have you worked here?" Victoria asked. 4 years. Never missed a day. Never been late. But lately, he gestured helplessly toward a bulletin board covered in work schedules. Victoria followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. The schedule was chaos. Crossed out shifts, reduced hours, handwritten changes that made no sense. David's name appeared sporadically, sometimes 22 hours, 1 week, 38 the next, then dropped back to 16. No consistency. No way to plan or budget for a family's basic needs. "They keep cutting my hours," David explained, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Sterling says it's corporate policy, but I don't understand. The store is always busy. We're always understaffed. Victoria's jaw clenched. She knew every corporate policy by heart, and this wasn't following any of them. Full-time employees were guaranteed consistent schedules. What she was seeing looked like deliberate manipulation. And when I asked about the health insurance that was supposed to start after 90 days, David's voice cracked. She said I wasn't eligible because my hours were too irregular. The pieces were forming a picture that made Victoria's blood boil, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep playing her role. That doesn't sound right, she said carefully. David looked around nervously, then leaned closer. There are others too. Jenny in electronics, Marcus in the stockroom. We're all having the same problems. But Ms. Sterling says if we don't like it, plenty of people would be happy to take our jobs. A chill ran down Victoria's spine. Rebecca Sterling. She remembered the name from the management roster. Store manager. Excellent performance reviews. No red flags in her file. At least none that had made it to corporate headquarters. Listen, Vicky. David continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. I need this job. My son. He's only 6 and without the surgery. He couldn't finish the sentence. Victoria watched as he pinned his name badge back onto his uniform with trembling fingers. That small silver rectangle represented everything to him. His son's medical care, their rent, their survival. And someone was using that desperation as a weapon against him. I should go, David said, glancing toward the main floor. My shift started at 5, but I'm supposed to stay until 3 for inventory. Ms. Sterling scheduled me for a 10-hour day, but somehow the system only shows 6 hours of pay. As he walked away, Victoria noticed his slight limp, probably from standing on concrete floors for years without proper support. The company handbook clearly stated that employees were entitled to anti-fatigue mats and ergonomic support, another policy that apparently wasn't being followed. Victoria stood alone in the hallway, staring at that chaotic schedule board. Each crossed-out shift represented a family struggling to survive. Each arbitrary hour cut meant someone choosing between groceries and gas money, between medicine and rent. She'd built Chen Global Retail on the principle that successful companies take care of their people. But somewhere in the gap between boardroom policies and floor-level reality, that principle was being systematically destroyed. The question was, how deep did this corruption go? And who else was suffering while she sat in her corner office, completely oblivious to their pain? Victoria pulled out her phone and opened the voice recorder app. Whatever was happening here, she needed evidence, and she had a feeling she was about to get plenty of it. Victoria didn't have to wait long to see the system in action. The next morning, she returned to the store at 4:45 a.m., 15 minutes before David's shift began. She positioned herself in the employee break room, nursing a cup of coffee and pretending to read employee orientation materials. At exactly 5:00 a.m., David clocked in. Victoria watched through the break room window as he moved carefully, favoring his left leg, but his face was determined. Whatever struggles he faced at home, he was here ready to work. His son, Miguel, needed him to be strong. At 5:32 a.m., Rebecca Sterling emerged from her office like a predator sensing wounded prey. Rebecca was everything Victoria had expected from reading her personnel file. Early 30s, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of cold confidence that came from having just enough power to abuse it. She wore her manager badge like a weapon, and her eyes immediately found David mopping near the pharmacy section. Rodriguez! Rebecca's voice cut across the store like a whip crack. David's shoulders tensed, but he continued working his movements, becoming more hurried. Rodriguez, I'm talking to you. He finally looked up, his face, carefully, neutral. Yes, Ms. Sterling. This floor is still dirty. What exactly have you been doing for the past half hour? Victoria watched David's jaw tighten. The floor was spotless. She could see her reflection in the tiles, but he simply nodded. I'll go over it again. You better. And next time, maybe try actually working instead of feeling sorry for yourself. Rebecca's voice dripped with contempt. Speaking of which, I need to see you in my office. Now. Victoria felt her hands clench into fists. She forced herself to stay seated to keep observing. If she intervened now, she'd blow her cover before understanding the full scope of the problem. In Rebecca's office, David stood while Rebecca remained seated behind her desk, a deliberate power play that made Victoria's skin crawl. Through the glass partition, she could see David's posture grow smaller. With each word, Rebecca spoke like a flower wilting under scorching sun. Jenny Walsh, the electronics clerk David had mentioned, slipped into the break room and sat down heavily beside Victoria. Jenny was young, maybe 19, with tired eyes that belonged on someone much older. Poor David, Jenny muttered, shaking her head. Third time this week, she's called him in there. What's she saying to him? Victoria asked, pulling out her phone and discreetly starting the voice recorder. Jenny glanced around nervously. Same thing she says to all of us. That we're lucky to have jobs. That people like us. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. That we should be grateful for whatever hours we get. People like us, you know. Immigrants, single mothers, people who can't afford to quit. Jenny's voice was bitter. Rebecca knows exactly who she can push around. Through the glass, Victoria watched Rebecca lean back in her chair, her body language radiating casual cruelty. David stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back like a soldier enduring inspection. Then Rebecca did something that made Victoria's vision go red. She pulled out David's timesheet and began making changes with a red pen right in front of him. She's cutting his time again, Jenny whispered. Probably claiming he took unauthorized breaks or something. Last week she docked Marcus 3 hours for excessive bathroom usage. He has diabetes. Victoria reached for her phone, making sure the recording was capturing everything. Through the thin walls, Rebecca's voice carried clearly. I told you before Rodriguez. If you can't handle the workload without getting emotional, maybe this isn't the right job for you. There are plenty of people who'd be grateful for your position. Please, Ms. Sterling. David's voice was barely audible. I just need consistent hours. My son. Your personal problems aren't my concern. What concerns me is that you've been talking to other employees about scheduling. That sounds like troublemaking to me. Victoria's thumb pressed record with more force than necessary. The threat was crystal clear. I wasn't making trouble. I was just trying to organize some kind of complaint, because that would be very unfortunate for your employment status here. David fell silent. Now I'm cutting you back to 10 hours next week. Maybe that'll help you focus on work instead of stirring up drama. And Rodriguez, Rebecca's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. If I hear you've been talking to anyone else about scheduling or policies, we'll need to discuss whether you're a good fit for this company at all. Victoria watched David nod silently, his dignity being stripped away, piece by piece. When he finally emerged from the office, his face was pale but composed. He walked past the break room without looking in his head, held high despite everything. But Victoria had heard enough. The phone in her pocket contained Rebecca's own words, a smoking gun that revealed the systematic abuse of power happening under Chen Global Retail's name. As Rebecca returned to her office, humming casually, like she hadn't just destroyed someone's week, Victoria felt something crystallize inside her. This wasn't just about David anymore. This was about every vulnerable employee who'd been ground down by petty tyrants like Rebecca Sterling. Later that morning, Victoria approached Rebecca's office. She knocked on the door frame and put on her most desperate expression. Excuse me, Ms. Sterling. I heard you might have some openings. I'm willing to work any shift, any hours you need. Rebecca looked up from her computer, her eyes immediately assessing this new potential victim. Victoria could practically see the calculations running through the woman's head. Another desperate worker to manipulate. Experience? Rebecca asked curtly. Retail mostly, but that dried up. I need steady work. I'm not picky about the job. Cleaning, stocking, whatever you've got. References? Victoria handed over a carefully crafted resume complete with fake references she'd arranged through contacts. These people will vouch for me. I show up, I work hard, I don't cause problems. Rebecca's smile was predatory. I like that attitude. Tell you what, Vicky, I can start you in custodial. Day shift $12 an hour. You'll be working with Rodriguez, but don't let him fill your head with complaints. He's got a tendency toward drama. The casual cruelty in Rebecca's voice made Victoria want to reach across the desk, but she forced herself to nod eagerly. That sounds perfect, ma'am. When do I start? Tomorrow, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. And Vicky, Rebecca leaned forward. I reward loyalty and hard work. Employees who understand how things work here do well. Employees who cause trouble don't. Victoria nodded like she understood perfectly. And she did, just not in the way Rebecca intended. That evening, Victoria sat in her hotel room staring at the recording on her phone. She'd captured systematic abuse wage theft and threats of retaliation, but she knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow, she would see firsthand how deep this corruption went. And Rebecca Sterling had no idea that her newest victim was actually her worst nightmare. Victoria's first day as Vicky began at 5:45 a.m. in the employee restroom, changing into the burgundy custodial uniform that would be her disguise. She pinned the temporary name tag to her shirt, the plastic rectangle feeling foreign after years of corporate power suits and executive meetings. When David arrived for his shift, he looked surprised, but pleased to see her. You came back, he said quietly. Told you I needed the job, Victoria replied. Guess we're working together. David studied her face, perhaps sensing something different about this new employee, but unable to place what it was. Stick close to me today, he said finally. I'll show you everything. And Vicky, everything I told you yesterday about being careful around Ms. Sterling, double that for the day shift. That's when she really shows her true colors. As the morning progressed, Victoria learned the intricate choreography of custodial work. But more importantly, she began documenting the systematic violations happening throughout the store. At 9:23 a.m., she watched Rebecca force Jenny to work through her legally mandated break, threatening to cut her hours if she complained. At 10:15 a.m., Marcus was denied access to the employee first aid kit when he needed to check his blood sugar, Rebecca claiming it was for emergencies only. But the real revelation came at 11:30 a.m., when Victoria discovered Rebecca's office door slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see Rebecca at her computer, and what she was doing made Victoria's hands shake with rage. Rebecca was logged into the employee scheduling system, systematically reducing hours for multiple employees. But she wasn't just cutting time. She was redistributing those hours to a phantom employee named R. Sterling Jr., probably her own son, or a way to pad her own overtime. Victoria pulled out her phone and began recording through the door crack. The evidence was right there on the screen. Systematic wage theft happening in real time. But then she saw something even worse. Rebecca opened another program, the health insurance enrollment system. She pulled up David's file and changed his employment status from full-time eligible to part-time temporary, despite his working full-time hours for 4 years. With a few keystrokes, Rebecca had just denied David the health coverage his son needed for surgery. Victoria felt a rage so pure it took all her self-control not to burst through that door. But she forced herself to keep recording to document every click, every theft, every casual destruction of a family's future. At 1:15 p.m., Rebecca emerged from her office looking satisfied. She called David over with a gesture that reminded Victoria of someone summoning a dog. Rodriguez, I need you to move all the pallets from the back room to the sales floor. By yourself. Victoria looked at the mountain of boxes. Easily a 4-person job. All of them, David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Problem with that, because I can call someone who won't give me attitude. No problem, Ms. Sterling. As David began the backbreaking work, moving hundreds of pounds of merchandise alone, Victoria understood something crucial. This wasn't just about money for Rebecca. It was about power. The joy of watching people struggle, of holding their lives in her hands and squeezing just to see them suffer. By 2:00 p.m., David was visibly exhausted, but Victoria had gathered enough evidence to destroy Rebecca's career 10 times over. Wage theft, benefit fraud, unsafe working conditions, workplace harassment. It was a masterclass in how to abuse every labor law on the books. But as her shift ended, and she watched David limp toward his second job at a nearby restaurant, barely able to stand after 8 hours of brutal work, Victoria realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just about Rebecca Sterling anymore. This was about a system that allowed predators like Rebecca to thrive while good people like David suffered in silence. And that system started at the top, with her. Victoria sat in her rental car in the parking lot, watching David walk slowly toward the bus stop. His shoulders were slumped with exhaustion, but he was going to another job because one wasn't enough to pay for his son's medical care. She thought about her penthouse apartment, her fleet of luxury cars, her vacation home in Aspen, all built on the backs of people like David, people whose names she'd never known, whose struggles she'd never seen. Tomorrow, it would all come to an end. But first, she needed one more piece of evidence. The smoking gun that would make her case unshakable. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She sat on her hotel room floor surrounded by printed emails, employee files, and financial records she'd pulled from the corporate database. The pattern was clear. This wasn't isolated to one store. Rebecca Sterling was part of a network of managers who'd learned to game the system. At 3 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop asking questions, or you'll end up like Rodriguez, with no job at all. Victoria stared at the message, then saved it as evidence. Rebecca was getting desperate, which meant she was getting close to something big. Victoria's opportunity came the next morning at 7:45 a.m. David had called in sick, the first time in 4 years according to his personnel file. Victoria suspected he was taking his son to the emergency room again, but Rebecca saw it as the perfect excuse for retaliation. Vicky. Rebecca called out, her voice echoing across the empty store. Since Rodriguez decided to abandon his responsibilities, you'll be covering the entire custodial workload today, alone. Victoria looked around the 50,000 square foot store. What they'd been doing with 2 people was already pushing the limits of human endurance. Asking one person to do it all was physically impossible. I can try, Victoria said, playing her role. You'll do more than try. And Vicky. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I've been watching you. I think you might be more reliable than Rodriguez. Prove it to me today, and I might have a permanent position for you. The implication was clear. David's job was on the line. As Rebecca walked away, Victoria felt the weight of her deception. She could reveal her identity right now, end this charade, fire Rebecca on the spot. But she needed more. She needed to understand the full scope of the corruption. At 10:30 a.m., Victoria's phone rang with an unknown number. She answered it while restocking paper towels in the customer restrooms. Is this the woman asking questions about Rebecca Sterling? The voice was female, nervous speaking in hushed tones. Who is this? I used to work there, night shift custodial. Rebecca, she destroyed my life. I heard through the grapevine that someone was finally investigating. Victoria's pulse quickened. Can you meet me? Parking lot behind the Denny's on Camelback Road. 1 hour, I'll be in a blue Honda. Victoria found the woman exactly where she'd said she'd be. Carmen Gutierrez, 38 years old, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd been through hell. I worked there for 2 years. Carmen began, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette. Same pattern. Rebecca would cut your hours until you were desperate, then offer to help you make up the money. What kind of help? Carmen's face darkened. Personal favors. Cleaning her house on weekends, running errands for her family. All off the books, all for cash that was way less than minimum wage. If you refused, she shrugged. Suddenly, you weren't a good fit for the company anymore. Victoria felt sick. Did you report this? To who? Corporate. Rebecca had friends there. Regional management. They were in on it. I even called the anonymous tip line. You know what happened? Rebecca got a copy of my complaint within 24 hours. She confronted me about it. Carmen flicked her cigarette into the parking lot. She fired me the next day, claimed I was stealing merchandise, had security escort me out like I was a criminal, blacklisted me from every retail job in the valley. Carmen, would you be willing to testify if I could guarantee your protection? Carmen studied Victoria's face intently. Who are you really? You're not just some new employee asking questions. Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her corporate ID badge, the one that read, Victoria Chen, Chief Executive Officer. Carmen's mouth fell open. You're the owner, and I'm going to fix this, but I need your help. For the next hour, Carmen detailed a network of corruption that went far beyond wage theft, sexual harassment, bribery, conspiracy to defraud workers' compensation claims. Rebecca Sterling wasn't just a bad manager. She was running a criminal enterprise. When Victoria returned to the store, her phone was buzzing with missed calls from David. She called him back immediately. Vicky. His voice was thick with tears. Miguel collapsed at school. They rushed him to the hospital. His kidneys are failing faster than the doctors expected. They want to do emergency surgery, but his voice broke. The insurance company denied the claim. They say I'm not eligible for coverage. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every moment she delayed taking action. David, listen to me. Everything's going to be okay. I promise you. I don't know what to do. I can't lose my son. You won't. Trust me. Victoria hung up and walked directly to Rebecca's office. She knocked on the door frame, and Rebecca looked up with that familiar predatory smile. Vicky, how's the workload treating you? Ready to prove yourself? Actually, Rebecca, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Something in Victoria's tone made Rebecca's smile falter slightly. About what? Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The recording app was already running. About David Rodriguez's son, about Carmen Gutierrez, about the phantom employee you've been using to steal wages. Rebecca's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Victoria stepped into the office and closed the door. I know about the hours you've been cutting. I know about the benefits you've been denying. I know about the personal favors you've been demanding from desperate employees. Rebecca stood up her chair, rolling backward. You're recording me illegally. You can't. Arizona is a one-party consent state, perfectly legal. Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. But wage theft, benefit fraud, and sexual harassment? Those are federal crimes. You don't know who you're messing with, Rebecca sputtered. I have connections. I'll have you arrested for what? Exposing the truth. Victoria reached into her other pocket and pulled out something that made Rebecca's blood drain from her face entirely. Her corporate ID badge, Victoria Chen, Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of shopping carts, the sharp intake of breath from a woman who suddenly understood that her world was about to end. My name isn't Vicky. Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I'm Victoria Chen. I own this company, and you, Rebecca Sterling, are finished. The explosion of reactions was immediate. Rebecca's face cycled through shock, fear, rage, and finally, desperate calculation. You can't do this, Rebecca screamed. I have rights. I have a contract. You had a contract, Victoria corrected. But fraud voids all employment agreements. Victoria opened her office door and called out to the sales floor. Security. 2 Chen Global Retail Security officers who had been positioned outside since 8 a.m. entered the store and approached Rebecca. Rebecca Sterling, you're terminated effective immediately. You're also under investigation for wage theft, benefit fraud, sexual harassment, and conspiracy. These officers will escort you from the premises. As security moved toward Rebecca, she made one last desperate play. You can't prove anything. It's their word against mine. She pointed toward the employees who had gathered to watch. Who's going to believe a bunch of immigrants and high school dropouts against a manager with stellar performance reviews? Victoria's voice cut like ice. I've got your own recorded confessions. I've got computer logs showing every illegal transaction. I've got photographic evidence of every violation. She stepped closer to Rebecca, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And I've got something else, Rebecca. I've got power, real power, the kind you've been pretending to have. Rebecca's shoulders sagged as the security officers reached her. This isn't over, she muttered. Yes, it is. Victoria turned to address the gathered employees. And for all of you, it's just beginning. As Rebecca was escorted from the store past customers who stopped to stare past checkout lanes where she'd terrorized employees, past the office where she'd orchestrated months of systematic abuse, Victoria felt a satisfaction deeper than any business deal she'd ever closed. But the real work was just starting. The silence after Rebecca's departure was deafening. 15 employees stood in a circle staring at their actual CEO trying to process what had just happened. David was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. You're really the owner. I am, and I owe all of you an apology. Victoria looked each employee in the eye. I built this company on the principle that we take care of our people, but I failed you. I got so focused on boardroom numbers that I lost sight of what was happening on the ground. Jenny stepped forward, still clutching her electronic scanner. So what happens now? Are we all getting fired for talking to you? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. These people were so conditioned to fear retaliation that even their liberation looked like a threat. Nobody's getting fired. In fact, we're going to fix everything Rebecca broke starting right now. Victoria pulled out her phone. I'm calling our head of HR. Every illegal hour, cut every stolen wage, every denied benefit. We're going to make it right. Within 20 minutes, Patricia Wang Chen, Global Retail's Chief Human Resources Officer, arrived with a team of 3 specialists and a stack of laptops. Victoria had worked with Patricia for 6 years, and she was one of the few executives Victoria trusted completely. Patricia, I need you to conduct emergency audits on every employee file Rebecca Sterling has touched in the past 2 years. Full wage restoration, immediate benefit enrollment for anyone who's been illegally denied coverage. Patricia's team spread out across the break room, setting up a temporary processing center. Taishu David Rodriguez, Patricia called out, consulting her tablet. David nodded nervously, still not quite believing this was real. According to Rebecca's records, you're classified as part-time temporary with no benefits, but your actual hours work show you've been full-time for 4 years straight. Patricia's fingers flew across her tablet. As of right now, you're classified as full-time permanent with complete health coverage retroactive to your original hire date. David's knees buckled. Victoria caught his arm as tears streamed down his face. My son's surgery, he whispered, fully covered. Pre-authorization will be processed within the hour. Patricia's voice was warm but efficient. And David, you're owed $18,347 in stolen wages and unpaid overtime. That check will be cut by end of business today. The sound that escaped David's throat was part sob, part laugh, part prayer. Around the room, other employees were having similar conversations as Patricia's team worked through the files. But Victoria wasn't finished. Everyone, I need you to listen carefully. She stood in the center of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a retail empire from a single store. What happened here can never happen again. So we're changing how this company operates. She gestured to Marcus, the diabetic stockroom worker who'd been denied access to medical supplies. Marcus, how long have you been wanting to move into management? Marcus dropped his clipboard. Ma'am, I've been thinking about it. But I don't have a business degree. You have something better. You know what it's like to work every position in this store, and you care about the people who work here. That's what I need in management." Victoria smiled. "How does assistant store manager sound?" Yes, ma'am, thank you." But the biggest change was yet to come. "David," Victoria said, turning to face the man who'd unknowingly triggered this entire transformation, "I have an offer for you." He looked up at her with eyes still red from crying, still struggling to believe his son would get the surgery he needed. "I'm offering you the store manager position." The silence was absolute. Even Patricia's team stopped typing. Ma'am," David stammered. I clean floors. I don't know how to." "You know how to work harder than anyone should have to. You know how to care about people even when you're being mistreated. You know every inch of this store and every challenge these employees face." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "David, you've been managing your own impossible situation for 4 years. Managing a store will be easy by comparison. But I don't have experience. I'll provide training. Full management development program business courses, whatever you need. Starting salary is $68,000 plus benefits with performance bonuses tied to employee satisfaction, not just profit margins." David stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. 68,000 Sao. That's just the starting point. Good managers who take care of their people get promoted to regional positions. Those pay 6 figures. Around the room, Victoria could see the transformation beginning. 15 people who'd walked in expecting another day of abuse were watching their lives change in real time. "One more thing," Victoria announced. "We're implementing an employee council at every Chen Global retail location. Representatives elected by workers with direct access to corporate leadership. No retaliation, no intimidation, no fear. If something like this ever starts happening again, you'll have a direct line to stop it." She pulled out a business card and handed it to David. "This has my personal cell phone number on it. If anyone, manager, regional director, even another CEO, ever treats you or your team the way Rebecca did, you call me immediately." Jenny raised her hand tentatively. "What about Rebecca? Does she just get away with this?" Victoria's expression hardened. "Rebecca's case has been forwarded to federal investigators. Wage theft is a felony. She'll face criminal charges and will be pursuing civil litigation to recover every penny she stole. Not just from us, but from you." Patricia looked up from her laptop. "Speaking of which, Victoria, we've identified similar patterns at 6 other stores. Same methods, different managers. Same response." Victoria's voice carried the weight of absolute commitment. "Full investigations, complete restitution, and anyone involved gets prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We're not just fixing this store, we're fixing the entire company." As the afternoon wore on, Victoria watched 15 demoralized employees transform into something she'd never seen before: a real team. People who'd been isolated by fear were now talking to each other, sharing stories, discovering they weren't alone. David stood in the center of it all, still wearing his custodial uniform, but now carrying himself differently. The man who'd been crying in a bathroom that morning was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand his own worth. "Thank you," he said to Victoria, his voice steady for the first time since she'd met him. "Not just for the job or the money, for seeing us as people." Victoria felt a tightness in her chest. "Thank you for reminding me what leadership actually means." As the sun set over Phoenix Chen Global Retail Store 47 looked the same from the outside, but inside everything had changed, and tomorrow the real work would begin. 3 months later, Victoria returned to the store for what she'd privately started calling her reality check visits. The scene that greeted her was almost unrecognizable from the place she'd infiltrated just a season before. The first thing she noticed was the sound laughter coming from the employee break room. Real laughter, not the nervous kind people make when they're afraid their boss might be listening. In the break room, she found Marcus training two new hires on the inventory system, his natural leadership abilities finally given room to flourish. On the wall behind him hung a framed certificate, Assistant Manager of the Month Employee Choice Award. The key is accuracy, not speed, Marcus was explaining to the trainees. We'd rather you take your time and get it right than rush and make mistakes. Nobody's going to yell at you for being thorough. Victoria smiled at the indirect reference to the old regime. Under Rebecca, employees had been terrorized into rushing through tasks, leading to errors that became excuses for further punishment. Near customer service, Jenny was helping a customer process a complex return. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew her job was secure, who didn't have to fear arbitrary punishment for following company policy. But it was David who represented the most dramatic transformation. Victoria found him in the store office bent over a laptop with the focused intensity of someone mastering new skills. He'd traded his custodial uniform for business casual attire, and his nameplate now read, David Rodriguez, Store Manager. How are the management courses going? Victoria asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Challenging. David admitted saving his work and looking up with a smile. I never thought I'd be learning about profit margins and employee development strategies, but it's amazing what makes sense when you've actually worked every job in the building. He gestured to a chart on his wall showing employee satisfaction scores. The numbers had skyrocketed from Rebecca's abysmal ratings to industry-leading levels in just 3 months. The team is incredible, David continued. Once people stopped being afraid, they started bringing me ideas. Marcus suggested cross-training everyone so nobody feels trapped in one department. Jenny designed a new customer feedback system. Even the part-time college kids are contributing innovations. Victoria looked through the office window at the sales floor where she could see the tangible results of David's leadership. Employees moved with purpose rather than fear. Customers were actually smiling as they interacted with staff who seemed genuinely happy to help. How's Miguel doing? Victoria asked. David's entire face lit up. He had his surgery 6 weeks ago. The doctors say the kidney transplant was perfect. He'll be able to run and play like any other kid. His voice caught slightly. He wants to meet you. He calls you the lady who saved Papa's job. I'd like that very much. There's something else, David said, pulling out a folder. Remember how you asked me to document any other situations like what happened with Rebecca? Victoria leaned forward, her attention sharpening. I've been talking to managers at other retail chains, not officially just conversations at industry meetups. Victoria, what Rebecca was doing, it's not uncommon. The wage theft, the benefit manipulation, the psychological abuse, it's almost like there's a playbook being passed around. He opened the folder to reveal a compilation of stories from workers across the retail sector. I think Chen Global Retail could lead an industry-wide change, not just fixing our own problems, but setting a standard that forces everyone else to follow. Victoria felt that familiar electricity of a big idea taking shape. What are you thinking? A certification program. Worker-verified fair employment, or something like that. Stores that meet the standards get the certification. Customers can choose to shop at places that treat employees fairly. And the verification comes from the workers themselves, not corporate self-reporting. Exactly. Anonymous surveys surprise audits real accountability. David's eyes were bright with passion. We've got the credibility now. Everyone knows Chen Global Retail was willing to investigate and fix its own problems publicly. Other companies would have to follow suit or look terrible by comparison. Victoria sat back impressed by the strategic thinking. 6 months ago, David had been afraid to ask for consistent hours. Now, he was designing industry-wide reform initiatives. Draft a proposal, she said. Full business plan, implementation strategy, budget requirements. I want to see it within 2 weeks. David nodded, already making notes. As Victoria prepared to leave, she took one more walk through the store. Near the electronics section, she spotted the bulletin board where Rebecca's chaotic scheduling had once terrorized employees. Now, it displayed a clean, predictable schedule where every employee knew their hours weeks in advance, alongside photos from the store's first ever employee appreciation barbecue. At the customer service desk, a familiar sight caught her eye: the same silver name badge that had fallen to the bathroom floor 3 months ago. But now it read, David Rodriguez, Store Manager, and it was pinned to a pressed shirt instead of a wrinkled custodial uniform. As she headed for the exit, Marcus called out from behind the electronics counter. Ms. Chen, before you go, we wanted to give you something. Marcus produced a framed photo. The entire store team gathered around the renovated employee break room, which had been upgraded with comfortable seating, a proper kitchenette, and large windows that let in natural light. In the center of the group, David held a small plaque that read, Chen Global Retail Store 47, Employee Choice Best Place to Work 2024. It's not an official award, Marcus explained with a grin. We made it ourselves, but we figured if anyone should decide whether a place is good to work, it should be the people who actually work there. Victoria accepted the photo, feeling an unexpected tightness in her throat. In all her years of business success, no recognition had meant more. Thank you, she said simply. All of you. As she walked to her car, Victoria reflected on how profoundly the last 3 months had changed, not just this store, but her entire understanding of leadership. She'd started this journey thinking she was rescuing her employees from a bad manager. Instead, they'd rescued her from becoming the kind of leader who loses sight of why businesses exist in the first place: to serve people, not just profits. Tomorrow, she would begin implementing the employee council system company-wide. Next month, David's industry certification program would get its full corporate backing. But tonight, she would go home knowing that 15 people were sleeping better, because someone had finally listened when they needed help most. 6 months after that life-changing morning in Phoenix, Victoria stood before a packed auditorium at the National Retail Federation's annual conference. The subject of her keynote address, Leadership from the Ground Up: What Happens When CEOs Stop Hiding in Boardrooms. Last year, I thought I was running a successful company. Victoria began, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. Our profits were up, our efficiency ratings were stellar, and our management reviews were glowing. By every metric that mattered to Wall Street, Chen Global Retail was crushing it. She clicked to the next slide, a photo of David in his custodial uniform taken from the store's security footage on that first morning. But I wasn't leading a successful company. I was presiding over a system that allowed good people to suffer while predators profited from their pain. And the worst part, I had no idea it was happening. The auditorium remained completely silent as Victoria walked the audience through her undercover experience. The wage theft, the benefit fraud, the systematic psychological abuse that had been happening under her own company's name. The truth is, real leadership isn't about commanding from above. It's about understanding from below. It's about recognizing that the people closest to the problem are usually closest to the solution. She clicked again. The new slide showed David at his desk wearing his store manager blazer, reviewing quarterly reports with his team. Today, David Rodriguez manages one of our highest performing locations. Employee satisfaction is at an industry-leading 96%. Customer ratings have increased 52%, and profits, they're up 28%, because when you treat people right, everything else follows. Victoria gestured to the audience where David sat in the front row representing Chen Global Retail at his first national conference. But this story isn't really about Chen Global Retail. It's about every company, every leader, every person who has the power to make someone else's day better or worse. The presentation continued with concrete results: the Worker Verified Fair Employment certification that 18 major retailers had already adopted, the industry-wide wage theft investigations that had recovered $4.7 million for workers, the federal legislation strengthening labor protections that had been inspired by their public disclosure. We've proven that doing right by employees isn't just morally correct, it's profitable. Companies with worker-verified certification are seeing average profit increases of 22% and customer loyalty improvements of 38%. As Victoria concluded her presentation, she returned to the personal story that had started it all. 6 months ago, I heard someone crying in a bathroom and decided to investigate. That moment of basic human curiosity changed everything. Not just for David, not just for Chen Global Retail, but for thousands of workers across the industry. She paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting this keynote live. So here's my challenge to every leader watching this. When was the last time you really listened to the people who work for you? Not in a scripted meeting or a sanitized survey, but really listened. When did you last see your workplace through the eyes of someone who can't afford to lose their job? Victoria stepped closer to the edge of the stage. Real leadership means lifting others up, especially when nobody's watching. It means using your power to protect people, not profit from their vulnerability. And it means having the courage to admit when your systems are broken and the determination to fix them. The final slide appeared a photo of the Chen Global Retail Employee Council meeting with representatives from all 63 stores gathered around a table as equals. The person crying in that bathroom could be in your company right now. The question is, will you hear them? And more importantly, will you act? As applause thundered through the auditorium, Victoria felt the same satisfaction she'd experienced that day when Rebecca Sterling was escorted from the store. But deeper than satisfaction was something else: purpose. After the presentation, as Victoria signed copies of the Harvard Business School case study that had been written about the Chen global transformation, a young executive approached her. "Ms. Chen, I think we might have some issues at our company that are similar to what you found. Where do I start?" Victoria handed him David's business card. "Start by listening, really listening. And when you hear something you don't like, don't rationalize it away. Fix it." Later that evening, Victoria called the store to check in with David, a ritual that had become part of her weekly routine. "How's Miguel doing?" she asked. "Perfect. His doctors say his kidney function is better than most kids his age. He's been asking when he can visit the store again. He wants to see Papa's office. Bring him by any time. I'd love to meet the little boy who helped save our company." Victoria. David's voice grew serious. "I got a call today from a custodial worker at Henderson Retail. She'd seen the news coverage and wanted to know if our employee council model could work at other companies." "What did you tell her?" "I told her to document everything, find allies among her coworkers, and that we'd help her build a case if she needed it. Was that okay?" Victoria smiled. "That was perfect. You're thinking like a real leader now." After hanging up, Victoria stood at her office window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. Somewhere out there in retail stores and restaurants and warehouses, there were probably other Davids. Good people, trapped in bad situations, waiting for someone with power to notice their pain. But now, there were also other Victorias. Leaders who'd heard this story and decided to look more closely at their own companies, their own responsibilities. Change was spreading one workplace at a time, and it had all started with someone brave enough to knock on a bathroom door and ask a simple question: "Are you okay?" The truth had been worse than anyone imagined, but the solution had been simpler than anyone expected. Treat people like human beings, and everything else falls into place. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is listen, and sometimes the most important voice in your company belongs to the person you've never bothered to hear. If you've ever witnessed injustice in your workplace, or if you're in a position to make change happen, remember David's story. Because the person crying in the bathroom might be closer than you think, and they're counting on someone like you to care enough to act.